capacity here, and then to enjoy learning a bit from the diverse range of perspectives here present in the room today. I've already learned a lot from my two colleagues. The question that this panel is wrestling with, how to assure successful outcomes, obviously defies a simple or straightforward response. To start with, those of you, and a lot of you I suspect here in this room, have field experience and comparative field experiences. And so you probably know there are a variety of pathways out of conflict. And we've seen them over the past 20 years. As the Cold War subsided, some conflicts were brought to closure through the constructive disengagement of the great powers, the Soviet Union, the United States, and their allies, in places from Central America to Southern Africa and Southeast Asia. Transitional authorities were established. Foreign fighters went home, whether you were a Cuban in Africa or Vietnamese in Cambodia. Internationally mandated peacekeepers flowed in. Programs for disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration got some traction. Elections were organized, roads were cleared, bridges were rebuilt, refugees returned home, market access was reestablished for farmers and merchants, miners and textile makers. Those were the easy cases. There are other pathways, and they're much more forbidding and much more difficult. Coercive interventions were needed in places like Bosnia, Kosovo, East Timor, Sierra Leone, in order to help bring those conflicts to closure, and hopefully not to reoccur. And in our two most current, our challenging and current venues, Afghanistan and Iraq, the U.S. led forced entry campaigns into those countries to oust pariah regimes, managed to establish new governments in the process, but our leaders at the time greatly underestimated what it would take to orchestrate successful stabilization and reconstruction campaigns to offset a rising tide of insurgency. And here I have to say, Larry, I side with the French. I like the stabilization first, but we can talk about it. So the pathways vary considerably, which brings me to my second point, and that is that the strategies and resources that we've sought to mobilize for this complex mission really do span traditional, professional, and bureaucratic boundaries within our national security policy community. Absolutely the case. This is inherently a joint civilian-military enterprise, one that, as Secretary Gates, my boss, has stressed over and over again, soldiers simply cannot do alone. But I have to also add that turning that essential insight into concerted action is very, very difficult. We have to, on each side of the fence, toss aside some outdated perceptions. Just as military commanders have to move beyond the notion that irregular warfare is basically about destroying the enemy as opposed to protecting local communities, our diplomats and our aid providers must let go of the notion that they can stay on the sidelines until the smoke clears. And they are letting go, and very impressively so. The sentiments that a great 19th century European diplomat once expressed to a military colleague, that when my profession fails, yours comes to the rescue, that really turns out to be a pretty poor guide for figuring out who does what and when in today's contested zones. Indeed, while it is certainly fair to ask whether foreign assistance instruments are becoming over-militarized, it's also worth underscoring the extent to which today's conflicts environments are becoming progressively more civilianized due to the vital importance of the contested state-building tasks upon which decisive outcomes hinge. Now, from the defense standpoint, much work has been done to identify the military's core competencies in stabilization and reconstruction missions. I would commend to you, for example, the Army's new Stability Operations Field Manual, FM 3-07, which was just released a few months ago. It works very judiciously through a full range of essential stability tasks, drawing on a lot of good existing work, identifies the enforcement of ceasefires and conducting security sector reform, all the way to extending protection over key facilities and vulnerable populations. What is very apparent is how much the S&R effort, even in its earliest phases, needs readily available civilian expertise and resources for everything from work programs for unemployed youth to the restoration of essential services or the vetting of local police recruits. And that raises the obvious question of using our military units to cover these needs as an interim stopgap measure, which very frequently, all too frequently perhaps, has been the case. Overall, we've learned a great deal about who should do what in these S&R venues, and you've heard from my colleagues about some ways to think about these challenges. The issue I'd like to put on the table in my remaining few minutes is how we can strive to build stronger and more mutually beneficial civil-military relations. Some of the challenges that we face in this regard are amenable to greater infusions of resources and expertise. Other challenges are not. They reflect inherent structural tensions which can be managed but not ultimately fully resolved or set aside. So to embellish a bit upon Reinhold Niebuhr's prayerful plea, we need the courage to overcome those obstacles which can be overcome, and I would say the tenacity to try and figure out workarounds for the challenges that can't be overcome and the wisdom to know the difference between the two. Which obstacles can be overcome? I think there are 4 that strike me as opportune, and progress is being made on all of them. First, we can do better at filling key informational and analytic deficits. I continue to be impressed that despite improvement, U.S. agencies still have a very long way to go in building a better knowledge base for current or likely operating venues. Improved situational awareness would help in shaping the terms of entry and generating better estimates of how interventions will reshape conflict dynamics within the country or region in question. Moreover, once deployed, information sharing between military and civilian elements remains difficult. Procedures need to be further refined so that data that are relevant for humanitarian or developmental purposes can default into a common user space, unless there is another purpose for that information and it's sorted into a classified channel. But we have to do better at improving information sharing in operational settings. And I look forward to hear more about that from SCRS and other colleagues. Secondly, improving our own self-knowledge. We pay it lip service all the time, but good lessons learned analysis does remain very hard to do. Within the defense community, despite some recent improvement, after-action reporting still remains pretty much the preserve of specific commands and military services. On the civilian side, the endeavor is developing some speed, but it has a ways to go. What's needed is a well-honed interagency process which can cull out and review incoming assessments from a growing array of sources, the blogosphere, commissioned studies, debriefings, using an widely agreed methodology for doing this. Such a process also would be a valuable corrective against the risk of overlearning, of proffering up one experience in one venue as a best practice with broad applicability to every other case. Third, we can improve, I think, improve capacity building at the retail level. I won't go into provincial reconstruction efforts here. So much has been discussed and debated. I'll simply note that the way ahead is still open, I think, for clearer interagency guidance on the planning and execution of projects done at the provincial level, for funding streams on the civilian side that are as flexible and responsive as those which have been available to military commanders, and more extensive team building, although there is some progress to report there, but it's more extensive team building so that the break-in time for newly arriving personnel on a site is as time compressed as possible. Finally, I think there's more we can do to remedy key capabilities and services shortfalls. Meeting the equipment needs of expeditionary elements, civil or military, in non-permissive environments is an ongoing challenge, as is providing comparable medical and other support for civilian personnel and contractors deployed by various agencies. Complex S&R operations draw heavily upon capabilities that the U.S. military, U.S. defense community has found it hard to mobilize: armored vehicles, non-lethal weapons, rapidly deployable demining and explosive ordnance disposal, anti-air defense systems, IED countermeasures. The list goes on. Progress is being made, but I think more can be made. Finally, what must be worked around? And I have 4 here, but I'll just tick them off quickly because I think I'm overstepping my time, or I'm just about to. First of all, we need to take steps, and I think we can, to smooth over tensions between diplomatic crisis managers on the one hand and expeditionary planners on the other. Whenever the U.S. takes a lead role in managing a brewing crisis, there is always going to be an inbuilt tension between these two communities. We've seen this vividly in the Balkans, in West Africa, and other regions. Crisis managers want to control the message being conveyed to foreign interlocutors for perfectly understandable reasons. They're concerned about press leaks. They therefore tend to be exclusive, to pull the circle very tight. Planners, by contrast, need to tap every available stakeholder that has authorities or resources to bring to the operation. They need to be inclusive. They need to draw the circle as widely as possible. The resulting problems can be predictable. Planning is delayed. A rush to finalize a peace settlement, if one materializes, generates pressure for quick decisions on force commitments, and implementers begin to pick apart the agreement at its weakest points. The best way to contain these tensions is to ensure that crisis managers have available a few dedicated, capable planners in their midst to advise on the upstream practicalities before the agreement is implemented and moves downstream. Secondly, there are issues, as Elizabeth mentioned, between balancing the short-term stability perspective and the longer-term reform perspective, and I won't go into that in detail now except to acknowledge that both perspectives are going to be there, and we have to work with them and through them. Thirdly, we have to understand and be content, not be content, but we have to understand that we are consistently going to have to manage tensions between partisan and impartial actors, between NGOs that see impartiality as key to their operational effectiveness and to their protection, as against those who are inevitably partisan actors on the battlefield. That's a big issue. There is no easy solution. Communication is important. To paraphrase Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner in another context, we probably are in different boats, but we're all heading into the same storm. Finally, we need to be better at managing competing lines of authority. At the end of the day, in a large mission, the mission's leading civilian officer and military commander are going to be working up through their respective chains. And there will be a need for consensus and team building through them, even if there's a clear line of authority. Ultimately, I think the American public has good reason to be worried about launching or seeing its leadership launch complex S&R contingencies, given how polarizing nation building and counterinsurgency have been over the last half-century. On the other hand, prevailing strategic conditions are not going to change anytime soon. We have to look and be ready to make tough decisions when the case arises. And I would say greater preparedness is not a license for wasteful, ill-advised intervention. It's, in the end, a safeguard against them. Thank you very much.
Well, let me thank all three speakers for doing a wonderful job in their presentations and for also keeping within the strict time frame so we can allow members of our audience to ask the questions that they need to ask. I just wanted to make one quick plug for Smart Power in that CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, did a Smart Power Commission and discussed some of these issues. So for those of you who haven't seen that, you can also go to the CSIS website. But as we know, the developmentalization of security, or the securitization of development, is a topic that you can hear is not going away. And I'm sure many of you in the audience have thought long and hard about how to approach what seem like contradictory yet converging issues that need to be at the center of any kind of work we are doing in the area of stabilization and reconstruction. We have microphones roving around the room. We have about 40 minutes left for this session, and if you would raise your hand, I'll call on you. I have a little difficulty seeing because of the lights, but I know that our talented people in the back have identified questions. So please go ahead, and we'll pass them either to a panelist, or you can name a group of people you want to answer them. Thanks. Do we have a first question? I think there was somebody over here at this table. Yes. There's a gentleman at this table over in the corner here.
I'm sorry.
Or, okay. Could you please, when you finally get the microphone, if you could state your name for the panelists so they know who they're talking to. Thank you.
I hope this is a question that's worthy of the effort to get here. I'm Doug Tinsler with Chemonics International. Suppose a hypothetical country in a hypothetical situation, which I know probably a number, particularly of the contracting community, have encountered in their experiences, where you're a contractor working in a conflict zone where there's active conflict, and you are a contractor doing development with no security clearance. The military is active in the area. There's a lot that you could offer the military in the post-kinetic thing for development interventions, but the parties don't talk because there's a security vacuum. The contractor is not with security clearance, and a situation is you've got a stovepipe situation that leads to less than optimal solution. It's a hypothetical situation, but I can say from our own experience it's real, and I suspect it happens more often than not.
Okay. Is this for the whole panel, sir? Or okay. Who wants to start?
You said ladies first. No, thanks. I'll be honest, I don't have a good answer. If I did, I think from an AID perspective, we would have already tried to implement something to address that very concern, because whether it's Chemonics or any of our other implementing partners, we know that whether it's Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Bosnia, countries in Africa from the past, you have been put in increasingly difficult security situations. I would offer the following thought, however. And again, I speak as Elizabeth Kvitashvili, not USAID in this perspective, because we are having this internal discussion, but we'll wait for the new administration to perhaps give us guidance on where they think we should go with this. And that is, should we be doing development in the face of active combat? I don't know. Some would say that you need to address the underlying causes, the root causes of why there is conflict through a developmental lens, whether it's addressing governance or livelihoods or the development or delivery of health and education services. So you need to do that in order to address the underlying root causes so people perhaps won't choose violence. However, as you've already said, how can you do that without inherent security? And if security is to be provided by the host country and they don't have the capacity, is there an expectation that our military counterparts are to provide it? I'm not going to speak on their behalf, but I think they've in the past said, no, that's not their role, and I wouldn't suggest that it might be. But I come back to the question then, should we be doing development in the face of active combat? And I do not have an answer for that.
I do, and convenient. I actually think it's impossible in the current environment to separate. There, better? I think it's impossible to separate conflict and non-conflict. To use another hypothetical, but Afghanistan, where I spent 3 or 4 years of my life recently, in a given province on a given month, you're post-conflict or you're in a reasonably stable environment, and then suddenly you're not. And then the season passes and it's back into a stable environment. And unless you're going to set up a revolving door of who's in and who's out, you can't say, I will only do X in one context or the other. I do think Elizabeth's right that you asked the foundational question, but for practitioners, be they corporate or NGOs or not-for-profits or the U.S. government, we're there. There's some optimism. The Ambassador Wood and General McKiernan have set up in Afghanistan, just a specific example, something called the Interagency Civil Military Action Group, the ICMAG. It's in the embassy. It reports to the Deputy Chief of Mission. It has his full support and authority behind it. It also is attended by a 2-star general on the military side. And it's an attempt to address exactly what you're saying, where capacities emerge in one particular stovepipe, to use your language, that can be laterally useful. The ICMAG is the point, if it doesn't happen at a lower level, where that can happen. I will also say in my field experience, if we let captains be captains and FS3s be FS3s, they will find ways to laterally pass information. And the problem with interagency coordination and multilateral coordination isn't at the tactical level, it's at the operational and the strategic levels. But we're trying to address that through this ICMAG, and I'm happy to talk offline more about that if you're interested.
Jim, did you want to contribute to that, or do you? Okay. Before we go on to, I really have problems with the light scene, so I'm going to rely on the good efforts of SID staff to help. But let me just ask you a quick question to the panel. You've talked about, Elizabeth, a new role or new vision of development, of local capacity building, of ownership, the way that Ashraf Ghani has described it. How is USAID currently trying to use some of those concepts in its own effort to work in some tough environments such as Afghanistan or in Iraq? And you can use other countries, I just mentioned those.
You mentioned new, and I think we would all agree that those are not new ideas. We as a community have been talking about local ownership, capacity building since development started. So they're not new concepts. I think, and I wanted to say in my comments, but I didn't, we talk a good talk. We don't necessarily walk a good walk. And by that I mean, I mentioned in my comments, and Larry addressed this as well, we are so eager to address the problem that perhaps we get out of front of ourselves. So we do want to build capacity, but as both Jim and Larry have said, we have this imperative to fix the problem today. And we may not have time, and it takes a long time, as we said, to build capacity of our counterparts to be able to do all these things. Where we have the luxury of intervening within a country, or engaging in a country, I should say, in a country where there is capacity, and it's just a question of building that capacity. I think we tend to have more patience. But as of late, because we've been engaging in many countries where capacity has been extraordinarily low, and because the mandate, the metrics have proven to be the bane of our existence in many cases, we've been unable to deal with the longer term consequences of what it means to do development smartly, because as we all know, it takes a long time to put successful development programs that are sustainable, that have local ownership in place. It's not the one-off projects, of which we've been very successful. It's that long-term growth we want to put in place. And so we know what we want to do. We've just, in some ways, not kept up with our own mantra.
Thank you. Audience?
Yes, may I answer?
Oh, please.
I don't disagree with anything. I don't disagree with anything that Elizabeth said, but I will put a marker down. Local ownership is the new bling. It's the new phrase of the day. For a while it was rule of law, and then it was democracy, and it'll be something else in 5 or 10 years. I was in Afghanistan when Elizabeth was in 2002 and 2003, and I would only temper the notion of local ownership with appropriate capacity. Had we turned the emergency loi jirga and the constitutional loi jirga in Afghanistan over to local ownership initially, it would not have succeeded. And there's a healthy and a delicate tension and a balance that we have to maintain between building institutional capability, which means that you let them do it, and you let them fail and stumble and fall if necessary, but you let them do it, and our need to deliver. And when our assistance is being provided in support of the global war on terror, for example, we can't wait the years or the decades for the institutional capability to be built. So I would like us to, instead of using the expression of just local ownership, to talk about institutional capacity and local ownership together. It's just a nuance, I guess.
Thank you. I saw somebody in the middle who had a question. Sir?
Yes, Steve McCarthy from ACDI VOCA. It may be too early to tell, but under the new administration, this is a question across agencies. Do you, in your deliberations with colleagues from other organizations in other forum in other countries, is there a growing consensus about the use of smart power amongst the European our European colleagues and others, so that we are building more of a global consensus on how to do this versus going it alone?
Right. The short answer is absolutely. I think there's been an appetite among our international counterparts to see us becoming more conscious of and more sophisticated in our ability to exercise smart power. SCRS, my office, the State Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization, is engaged with, at a core level, 5 countries, and at a larger level, almost 20 countries, who are developing some of the same comprehensive approaches or whole-of-government approaches to exercising smart power. So absolutely there's an appetite. And the challenge now for us collectively internationally is coordination mechanisms. We call it whole-of-government, they call it comprehensive, we call it S&R, they call it R&S, those kinds of issues. But absolutely there's an appetite.
I actually claim to have the soft side of hard power portfolio over in the Pentagon, but I'm very drawn to the concept, and my mentor and former mentor Joe Nye was instrumental in that. I would say, though, that with the whole of government approach, one has to balance that out. Inclusion, as I sort of said, inclusion has virtue, great virtue, and getting insight, but the community has to be able to concentrate, focus, and move